Okay, so this is a new version of a talk that was actually given last year, but apparently didn't make much of an impression last year because John asked me to give it again. So here we are, the Soar language server protocol, a new approach to Soar IDE support. So basically, there's been lots of different editors in Soar's past, and I've only listed some of them here. But basically, they all involve insufficient levels of maintenance, which is still going to be an issue. But they also involve they're too opinionated in one way or another. Either they impose a particular structure on your Soar agents, or they lock you into to a particular IDE, and then when that IDE is no longer the new hotness, then something else is what people want to use, and then they can't, and so on. So basically, we want to avoid all of that at some level. And the other thing that we require that, say, U of M doesn't necessarily require is sophisticated Tcl support, because we do almost all of our agent development makes heavy use of Tcl. And so that's something that, say, like Visual Soar never supported. So we've got a fresh start now with something based on the language server protocol, and I will describe what that is here. So historically, editors for any language were written, like support, say, for JavaScript in Vim would have been written specifically for Vim, like someone would have made a Vim plugin or something. And then, that would have been the JavaScript support there. And then they would have rewritten that JavaScript plugin for, other Eclipse, Intellij, Emacs, whatever. Okay. And what the language server protocol does is it defines a IDE independent way of describing the sorts of things that an editor needs to do, such as auto-completions or the location of symbols and stuff like that. And then each IDE then just has to implement this generic plugin that knows how to connect those specific sorts of things to that particular IDE. And then any language that can provide those sorts of things automatically connects to those other IDEs, quote unquote, for free. Okay, and I say quote unquote because it's, of course, never that simple. So there's a bunch of things we can do, but I'm just actually going to switch to the demo. So let me pick that out real quick. I'm going to do most of the demo here in Visual Studio Code because it is the gold standard for LSP support, but I will show a bunch of other IDEs as well. So there are, so this is a Tank Soar agent that was rewritten in NGS4, which is a Tcl library for doing Soar code. So there are a bunch of things that you get just out of the box. Oh, actually, before I should say that, in order for it to work, you have to create this Soar agents JSON file, which should go in the root of your project. And in here, you basically define all the agents that are in your project. Many projects probably only have one, but if you do have more than one, then you would define what they are and where their start file is, essentially. This active is only for breaking ties. So like if two different agents define the same symbol, which one does it go to when you say go to definition? It's the active one. And right-hand side functions are custom right-hand side functions that your agent uses that you don't want it to produce errors for because this is not connected to your actual application in any way. And so you may say, my application uses a right-hand side function called myCoolFunction, and now it won't say, like, I don't know what that function is as an error when you're trying to write your code. So anyway, you got to create a file like that. And then you get your basic things that you would expect, like if I have an error in my code, it's going to say, hey, you're missing this arrow symbol in your code. Oh, okay, let me put that back in. And then it eventually goes away. And you can do, code folding and so on. So these are features that would work even if you're not using Tcl in your code. But a lot of the most interesting features are all about using tickle code. And so if I'm going to move this, there's a special file that gets created called ~tickle expansion. And if I were to click on this rule, this has a bunch of tickle in it, but it produces actual Soar code. So you can see what the actual Soar code is. Over here, I can actually select multiple rules if I want to, and it just shows them all. There are some commands that don't even look like rules, like this guy right here, that would produce more than one rule automatically, and so it just handles all of that. And then for these different macros, I can say control click on this, and it'll take me to the definition of that macro. You can also see, if I go to the top of this file, that it knows that this file belongs to both the goal-based agent and the wander agent. And it knows that this one only belongs to the goal-based agent. You can hover over these things to get their documentation. If you, it does autocomplete as well. So I can see that not only is there NGS match goal, but there's a bunch of other things that start with that string, and I can browse through them and see, their help text and so on. And if I actually do that, so let me put in a new NGS match goal. It'll actually fill in the parameter names for me. And so these first two, the state ID, that would be like S, and the goal type and the goal ID. And then here you can see that these are optional parameters and what their default values are, and so on. So if you're doing tickle code in Soar, you really want to do it this way. Let's see, you can also find references. I'm like, where exactly does this get mentioned? Oops, I didn't want to go to references. I just wanted to find the references. And then you can see all the references here on the side. You can also hover over tickle variables and get their values. So like if I hover over this, I see that that has the value achievement. It also, for the tickle values, it does something kind of interesting, which is it will tell you what the tickle value is at that time. And so, for example, here, this value has, this tickle variable has the value turn direction decision. So I'm going to take this tickle variable and I'm going to reset it to something else like foo. And then if I hover over here, it still has the old value because the new value doesn't take effect until after this. But if I hover down here, it has the new value. Like it can tell that it switched value in the middle of sourcing. So yeah, so those are some of the cool features. Now let me quickly show you a bunch of other IDEs. This is Intellij. Let me go back to an actual, here we go. It has some of the same sorts of things. So if I hover over this, no, it's not going to do it. Does it do? Yeah, so it does the autocomplete. It does the control clicking and so on. It turns out that not every IDE has fully implemented their LSP support. And so not everything works in every IDE. And so, for example, in Intellij, they don't let you make the tickle expansion file. And so it can't, it doesn't update the expansion for tickle in that file, which is unfortunate. Here it is in Sublime. This one has even more limited support, but at least it gives you the go to definition, which is nice. That's something. Let me see, I've got it in Eclipse over here. This one doesn't have syntax highlighting. I'm going to talk about syntax highlighting in a moment, but you can still control click to go places if it's going to let me. There we go. So that you can like go to the definition of things, and yeah. So anyway, different IDEs have different levels of support. Visual Studio, or VS Code has the best support. Okay, going back to my presentation. Okay. So LSP doesn't do everything. In particular, LSP doesn't do syntax highlighting. That's not part of its scope right now. It's something that they've talked about. And so it could be that in a few years it does do syntax highlighting, but right now it doesn't. And so what that means is that you still have to provide syntax highlighting, or someone has to provide syntax highlighting for each IDE. And so some of them already have it. So for example, Sublime, Nate Glenn, I believe several years ago, wrote a plugin for Sublime that provided syntax highlighting. I think someone's written one for Vim, someone's written one for Ultra Edit, someone's written, then the VS Code one, it turns out, can be used by Intellij. You can just like directly use the same grammar. And so that's why I had syntax highlighting in Intellij. Eclipse can too, but you have to wrap it in a plugin, and so that's why I don't have it there. There's no debugging support. This is not supported by any of the previous editors either, and it's not directly supported by LSP, but there is a sort of sibling protocol called the debug adapter protocol, which is not as mature as LSP. That is an attempt to do the same kind of thing that LSP is doing, but for debugging. There's no data map. There's no templates. There's no automated modification of the root files. Like, it's not going to automatically add a source file when you add a new Soar file, or a source command when you add a new Soar file, for example. It's not to say that it couldn't, it just doesn't right now. Yeah, I talked about this. Here's these IDEs. Here's Emacs. I didn't show Emacs today because I don't actually know how to use Emacs, but it does work in Emacs actually really well. It works just as well in Emacs as it does in VS Code. And I am under the understanding that it works super well in Vim also. But I have not, I don't think anyone's tried to actually use it there. It's just that it's supposed to have all the support, the same level of support that Emacs and VS Code do. So, okay, nuggets in Cole. It's no longer do we have editor lock-in, yay. It supports lots of features from both plain Soar and Tickle, which is good if you use those things. And if you don't use Tickle and you're writing complicated real-world applications, you really should. And it's a solid modern base for future development. So it's something that people might actually want to work on, as opposed to whatever the APIs for Eclipse were in 2004, for example. And it's open source, and so contributions are welcome. There's, like I said, on the Cole side, there's no syntax highlighting, but you can probably use the one that VS Code uses. It's a TextMate grammar, and lots of IDEs support that. You may need some workarounds for some Jsor commands that don't exist yet in Jsor. So like, for example, commands that have to do with the new chunking 2.0 stuff, right? Or subcommands of that. And the workaround is really easy, actually. You just define a tickle proc that does nothing, that has, the name of the command that you want to emulate, and then it won't give you an error about it. It can be difficult to set up an IDE that doesn't have a dedicated plugin. So theoretically, you can just manually run the LSP server and just connect to it. And that's what I was doing for all of those different systems, except for VS Code, which has, it's in the marketplace for VS Code because we made a plugin for it. And if you were trying to use it on some other
Hi.
For me, IDE that doesn't have a plugin made for it, then trying to figure out the incantation. Are you there? Sorry. Okay, so anyway, that's all I have. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you. So there is a question in the chat. Mohinder asks, which IDE would you recommend if someone is just starting out with Java Soar so that their introduction can go as smoothly as possible?
VS Code.
Cool.
And I should also point out that VS Code is cross-platform. So if you're on Mac or on Linux or whatever, it should just work.
Yes, and Nate left a comment that he wanted to publicly thank the SoarTech/LSP team for this software because it's great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's definitely a team effort, and I am not the one who did most of the work, but you know, here I am.
Great.
So, yeah.
So we have 5 minutes before the final talk should start. So
if you want, I could go back and talk more about the future of Jsor.
I think people would like that, so go ahead.
Okay, switching back. Okay. Let me go. Okay, so currently, like I said, Jsor is in maintenance mode, and what that means is we continue to fix bugs. We continue to update things as needed. For example, for the JavaScript support, we are currently using Nashorn, which is built into the JVM, but they've deprecated Nashorn, and so we're probably going to be switching to Graal.js in the future. And so, you know, that's the kind of thing that where we will do that kind of thing because we need those features as, you know, SoarTech. When I say we, I mean SoarTech, and need those features to continue working. Major feature updates like chunking 2.0 or the latest changes to EPMEM and so on are only going to happen if there's a strong demand signal and sufficient funding. And so far at SoarTech, at least, there is neither. We do have some projects that have been playing around with chunking 2.0, but they're all Jsor projects. And so we do tend to use Jsor a lot on things like robotics, where like the environment is natively like C-based, as opposed to like say a web server that's going to be Java-based. So anyway, that's the kind of the situation. And I do want to also point out how expensive it is to keep these things up to date. When we ported episodic memory back when Soar 9.3 came out, that took about 600 hours of work. It was probably 200 hours of actual like initial porting where all the code was over, and then 400 hours of debugging. So yeah. So anyway, we can only expect that something like chunking is going to be just as much, and that's very expensive for SoarTech to just like internally fund. Management will ask the question, what's the opportunity cost? So anyway, there does continue to be a demand signal for Soar because it turns out that when you want a Java application, you just want a Java version because it's so much easier. And in particular, SoarTech is using it on lots and lots of projects. In the long term, it might actually be better to switch to a approach where we're wrapping Jsor sort of better than than how it's currently being wrapped by Swig. But I think that that's going to be a huge amount of work as well, because I think we're going to have to actually change some of the Jsor APIs, like we might not use XML at all, for example, and in order to get the kind of behavior and performance that we are looking for. But we would also do things like, for example, package the native libraries, which is a big sticking point, it turns out. Package the native libraries inside the Java jar so that when you're running it, it just works. Like it'll like on the spot unpack them from the jar in the right place and be able to find them, for example. You don't have to do anything. Like from your perspective as a user, it'll look like it's just a Java library. But again, this is going to be hugely expensive. At least up front. In the long run, hopefully it's actually cheaper. And so we're going to need support from the community, both to say that, yes, you know, we want these things, so we need the demand signal and the input, like, here's how I think it should work, or the kinds of features that must work, or if you're going to make all these changes anyway, can you also add this feature or whatever? And if we had identified sources of demand and suggestions and so on, that would be make it a lot easier to identify, to say, like, to convince management basically that it's worth investing in. And of course, we would be looking for community support to help with the actual implementation as well.
Okay. Thanks for telling us more. It is now time for the next talk.